My name is Dan Gilbarg. I'm a professor of sociology here at BCC, and I'm also the chair of the Multicultural Committee, which is sponsoring this presentation. As you may know, the Multicultural Committee has had a full program all semester long on a variety of topics. This is the last event. It's been very successful, and we're planning to continue on for next semester, so hopefully you'll have an opportunity to attend some of the other events in the future. The topic we're dealing with today is racial inequality in education, and this is something that is a persistent and significant problem in our society. Although we've made some progress, we still have a long ways to go. It's something that goes back a long time, and a lot of people are putting their heart and soul into trying to address it. And one of the people that works on this issue in the academic field is Micah Pollock. Micah is a professor at Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She has written 3 books. 2 of them are research books to help us understand the dynamics of race as it relates to education. And the 3rd book is entitled Everyday Racism and is the topic of today's talk, where she's brought together ideas from educators around the country who have all, in one way or another, come up with ideas about how to overcome racial inequality in the schools. Micah also has another qualification in addition to her research and writing, which is that she is my niece, and so very proud of her. So anyway, the format for today, we have about 70 minutes. Micah will be doing a PowerPoint presentation and will be entertaining questions. So please, if you have any questions, think about what they are, and then you can ask them after her talk. Thank you very much. Let's welcome Micah Pollock.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for being here. I was saying to Dan that I'm amazed how many cars are in the parking lot so early in the morning. You guys are dedicated. So it's really nice to be here. And also to be here sort of at the feet of some of my mentors, Marlene and Dan. Who wants to be a teacher? Anybody? Okay, who's been to school? Anyone? Anyone been to K-12 school? Nobody went to elementary school? Nobody went to high school? Okay, we've all been in school, right? So we're all here ready to work on these issues together, actually, because the stuff I'm talking about is about K-12. I've been working on, like Dan said, racial inequality in education for quite a long time. As a teacher, I worked in the civil rights field at the Office for Civil Rights. Then decided to become a professor again to be able to speak my mind on things, and have focused my energy for the first chunk of my career on working with teachers, actually. To think about their everyday actions and what they mean for kids. That's really where the focus of my work has been. So what I wanted to sort of bring you in on today was this professional development effort I've been doing with educators. But the idea is this is stuff we've all experienced. This is stuff we all have something to say about. And so even if you're not going to be teachers, I need your opinion and your thoughts and your brains for this today. So this project is called Everyday Antiracism. And really, what it's about is trying to get, like I said, teachers to say, do the actions we take have the best outcomes we could hope for young people? It's really the same question of any professional development for any educator on anything. A lot of time in education, I don't know if you feel this in higher ed, now that you're here, we separate diversity stuff over here and the rest of life over here as if they're somehow separate issues, but really it's all the same thing because we live in a diverse world. We live in a world that has inequality in it, so if you're going to learn to be a teacher, you got to be able to engage those issues. That's what we live with. So we're just engaging the race issues of being a teacher in this project. We're asking questions like, we work in a diverse society with inequality in it. What actions are most helpful to young people in that world? I'm also working on other stuff. I've moved into the realm of technology. I'm not going to talk about that today, but you might want to Google the Oneville project. I live in Somerville, Mass., and we're doing a big project in Somerville that's about trying to get people throughout a city using technology like texting, like social networks, to stay on top of kids' everyday experiences. So it's the same idea, just in a new form. What I want to talk to you about today is about getting teachers to think together about the everyday acts they take and the everyday experiences kids have in their classes. So we're asking educators, a lot of times in higher ed, we ask people to think about really big ideas, which is really important. You know, big policies, giant abstract issues. But we're trying to get teachers to think about things like, how do I discipline my kids? How do I talk to my kids on a daily basis? How do I assign kids to groups? And what are my struggles with that? How do I grade a paper? How do I interact with a parent? These are the kind of level of stuff we're talking about. And again, we are trying to work on something that a lot of people don't work on in higher ed, especially in schools of education, which is opening the door for educators to talk about the race, class, inequality, diversity aspects of their work. A lot of classes in ed school don't do that. So here's what we're talking about when we say everyday anti-racism. What do we mean here? We mean simply getting educators to think about which of my actions counteract inequality, counteract inequalities of opportunity, of outcome, of access to resources. But we also want to think about which of my everyday actions counteract harmful ideas about types of people, which is another big issue of what racism in American life for a long time has been about. Right here is something I want to train your attention on. I'm always looking, I study talk in the rest of my world, how we communicate. And I'm always looking for tools that help people talk better about stuff. And this one right here, this number line, has been the tool that has helped the most teachers. After all this work, they come out of all of my workshops and classes and whatever, and it's this tool that they find the most useful to them. It's simply a number line. You remember from way back, from algebra, from negative numbers? It's asking people to say, does this everyday act I took today move a young person toward opportunity, toward success, toward his full or her full potential, or away from it? It's getting people to evaluate their everyday acts. And again, the way I taught that book, the way I referred someone to special ed, these are the things we're trying to get people to think about. Why bother even putting a race frame on all of this at this point in history? If I were giving this talk a couple of years ago, you might have a different reaction to me than now. It's a slightly different situation in the country about how people are expressing their beliefs about race issues. A lot of times in schools, we don't talk about race issues at all. It is exhausting. It can burn people to have a conversation about race in a faculty meeting. My first book was called Color Mute, and it was about a high school where I taught in California where nobody ever really publicly talked about race issues. Privately, everybody did. Publicly, no. So publicly, never engaged things like racial patterns and who was being suspended, racial patterns and who was being put in special ed, with or without the need for it, for example. I came to call that color muteness because it wasn't like we weren't seeing people through race lenses, we just weren't talking about it. So I called it color muteness instead of color blindness. And what happened when we didn't talk about this stuff was we let a lot of problematic patterns sit there as if they were normal and okay. So color muteness had a lot of negative effects for us. At the same time, conversations that didn't thoroughly deal with who's in special ed or who's in being suspended also weren't helpful to young people. So better conversations rather than just more conversations about race is what I ended that book calling for. Why were people color mutes? A lot of them were afraid of sounding racist, so they didn't want to say anything. Sometimes we were afraid of, or people were afraid of making things worse for young people. And so this book, Everyday Anti-Racism, I invited 100 people to participate in it, and 70 people in the end participated with making these little short essays for educators to read or anybody to read, and the idea is to prompt conversation about stuff we deal with in school so that these issues are dealt with in an ongoing way rather than in the heat of crisis. Let me tell you one more reason why I did this book. I told you I used to work in the civil rights field at the Office for Civil Rights. Anybody ever heard of it? Anymore? It's in the US Department of Education. What we did was investigate discrimination complaints from across the country, from parents, sometimes from teachers, from community organizations and stuff like that. And a lot of times, people locally could not deal with talking about inequality, so it went up the chain to the federal government where lawyers investigated it as a discrimination investigation. So much better to deal with these issues locally on a regular basis. Okay, why else is it important to think about racial inequality in education or wade through race conversations either in higher ed, keep applying to your own life now, in higher ed classrooms, or if you're an educator, K-12. There are a lot of racialized ideas still floating around in American air that affect kids, like who's going to be a scientist, who's going to be a lawyer, who's AP material. And these kinds of ideas, along race lines and along class lines and along language lines, really affect how young people think about themselves and their potential, and how teachers think about kids and their potential. And teachers sort kids, and kids start sorting themselves out of AP, for example. And that's really serious business, and that's why it's also really crucial to talk about racial inequality at this level, at the level also of the everyday things that happen to us and that we do in schools. One last reason why it's important to work on this issue at this level. The best definition I ever heard about what education is supposed to be about was from a book by Vincent Harding, who's a historian, and it was made in a sort of anti-racist moment, which is right after the Civil War. And black delegates in Charleston, South Carolina, they petitioned the legislature for basic human rights. They said, after the Civil War, they said, we want the right to discuss politics, we want the right to be able to, build wealth, we want the right to farm, but they also added another right, a human right, and they said, we want the right to develop our whole being by all the appliances that belong to a civilized society. And that, to me, is what education is supposed to be about. And if you go into the teaching field, that's what should get you up in the morning, helping young people develop their full potential. That's what this is about. All right, one last thing. You might find this in higher ed, too. Again, apply throughout the morning. A lot of times when we talk about race issues with teachers, we either start with, let's talk about your beliefs, or we say, let's talk about your actions. In this project, which I'm going to call EAR, because everyday anti-racism takes too long to say, EAR really starts with getting us to think about our actions, the things we do on a daily basis. And the point of that is to get us then to think about our beliefs. So we end up asking really big questions about what's the right thing to do when we think about how we treat kids. Would I take this own act? Carolyn Tyson's an author in the book. She says the best question of all to ask, would you take this act if it was your child? That's really the deepest question of all to ask a teacher. And that's how we end up thinking about our beliefs. Okay, what do we mean by racism? That's really important to say in 2010, because the word has been really screwed up by lawyers, and I have met a lot and worked with a lot of lawyers, and they have screwed up the word, racism. Because what they've made us think is that the only thing that can count as racism is a moment where someone really actively, cruelly says, I'm going to take something away from you because of your race, and everything else doesn't count. What we're interested in this project is even moments when we tolerate racial inequality, like I said, as if it's just kind of okay and normal. Moments when we accept or reinforce opportunities that are unequal. So in the schools I'm working in now, in the school where my daughter goes, for example, there's a lot of stuff that just gets tolerated. Stuff that, for example, resource issue, it's hard to get everything translated. A lot of stuff goes out just in English, and there's a lot of toleration of huge chunks of parents not being able to understand really critical things. To me, I would put that in the bucket of harm that needs to be dealt with, that it's not just normal. Anything that allows sort of these inequalities along the lines of race, but also class, ethnicity, national origin, as if they're normal and acceptable. And also, at the core, that treats people of color as less worthy or less complex than white people. That's the core dynamic of what racism has been about. Gender inequality has another dynamic, language inequality, class inequality, same dynamic and in another form. It's really important to talk about racism this way in 2010. If we were together in 1950, or earlier, we would be talking about examples where people would literally get up on the floor of the Senate and say, I am denying you opportunity because of your race. Now we really much more have situations where we simply tolerate inequality as if it's just how things are normal. Carolyn Tyson, who I mentioned, she has looked at schools in North Carolina that are almost all black, where the gifted class is 99% white. Now, when we sort of say that's normal and just how school is here in this school, then we would put that in our bucket of stuff that tolerates inequality and that needs to be challenged. When we tolerate kids, I know there was there was a presentation here earlier, a few weeks ago, months ago, about the school to prison pipeline. If we tolerate kids vanishing from graduation and ending up in prison, as if that's normal and just sort of the way of American society, we would put that in our bucket of harm that needs to be counteracted. Now, what's really important here is unwittingly, we're not talking necessarily about acts where people really consciously are setting forth to harm children. Teachers often don't go into the field to harm kids, okay? We're often talking about acts where people let stuff stand as if it's normal or don't ask each other about it. And a lot of us today, this is really important, we let disparities or inequality stand because it's so overwhelming, because we don't know what to do about it. And that's why it's so important to also focus attention on our everyday acts, even as we also think about policies and who gets which health care, who goes to which schools get funded, et cetera. All right, so I tried to get a lot of people to suggest acts of everyday anti-racism that a teacher could take. And again, we're skipping arguments about who's a good person, who's a bad person. We're saying which acts are most helpful to young people. I also wanted to ask us to go beyond abstractions, because a lot of times, especially teachers, are overwhelmed with a lot of ideas that are really abstract, like celebrate diversity. That's crucial, but it's pretty abstract. Be colorblind. Don't be colorblind. Be race conscious. Put race on the table. Have high expectations. These are all core important ideas. At the same time, you can hear them wash over you and still not know what to do with yourself when you walk into the classroom. And it also, that advice doesn't anticipate some of the minefields. Maybe you yourself have experienced some of this as a student in high school or before that. There's a piece in the book by Donna Daly where she talks about a teacher who's trying to celebrate diversity, okay, by putting up a poster on the wall. She happens to teach a number of Native American students. She puts this totally outdated, anachronistic poster of an American Indian in a headdress, as if everybody, all American Indians are the same, and one picture represents everybody, and the young man is sitting in front of her and says something like, "You guys were so noble, we should have just left you on the reservation." Trying to celebrate diversity. She has a poster up on her wall. Kid, sort of his relationship to the school melts at that moment, and he never really comes back with a positive reaction to his school. Active anti-racism would be actually thinking through the complexities of Native American life today. That would be active anti-racism. Simply sticking up a poster, one attempt at celebrating diversity doesn't go the distance. Here's another example. Maybe you have experienced this one. This is Christine Sleeter's suggestion in the book. She talks about this situation where the teacher says to herself, what are we going to read this year? I want to diversify my syllabus. And she looks out at the room, and she says, okay, you're going to want to read this to herself. I think you'll read, okay, and you're going to want. She actually has no idea what you want to read or how you classify or group yourself. And so what she advises in the end as active anti-racism is how about asking young people to also suggest something that you want to read that semester, and also to remind us that sometimes people want to look in the mirror when we're reading literature, and sometimes we want to look through a window at somebody else's experience, and we might want those two things at the 2 different hours of the same day. So let's not oversimplify the people in our schools as teachers. Here's one more way that oversimplified stuff can backfire. When I was a teacher, actually restarted as a researcher at the same school, the faculty went on a trip to connect to the community, which is another abstract piece of advice that we get as educators. And what they did was they got on a bus and they drove through the neighboring housing project, and everybody looked out the window at people, and then they came back and they sat on the stage and they said, man, we feel so bad about them. Their lives really suck. That was not treating people as complex. It was not getting out of the bus to meet anybody, to actually see what efforts were going on in the housing project, et cetera. So you see where I'm heading at? Connect to the community is incredibly important advice. If you don't think through the details of doing it respectfully, it can backfire on you. So teachers, in particular, need to go beyond abstract advice. They also need, this is really, really important, to be able to think about how their everyday acts can make a difference. Because a lot of teachers leave the field, quit, because they start feeling like there's no point. I don't accomplish anything. Inequality is too big for me. And so it's really important to think on 3 levels about how inequality works and to talk about this very explicitly with teachers. And I imagine in higher ed in general, when you're sitting and thinking about what you might do, what can I do about racial inequality? We really need to know that our everyday acts matter, especially as with No Child Left Behind, there are a lot of achievement charts going up on the wall, okay? All over the country. Achievement gap, achievement chart, achievement chart. You can look at that thing and your eyes glaze over and you start to normalize those patterns and say what I do is irrelevant. That's a problem. Another reason why racial inequality is really hard to talk about today. Anybody ever read anything by Charles Payne? Anyone? You should Google Charles Payne. He writes really great stuff, P-A-Y-N-E. And he has this idea that I built on one of my projects about racial inequality today is fragmented. Meaning, as opposed to Jim Crow, remember the Senate floor, I'm going to get on the floor and say, you are getting less money because you are black. Today we have racial inequality built through all kinds of fragmented acts by all kinds of people. So something like the school-to-prison pipeline, it's not like there's someone at the top necessarily always saying, you're going in the pipeline and you're not. Who ends up in prison is a mix of all kinds of things, all right, including everyday acts of discipline, as well as who funds which laws and things like that. So it's important to think about everyday acts. if you think for 1 sec, I'm going to give you this model in 1 minute from Rebecca Blank, which I find incredibly useful for thinking about this. But let me give you some everyday examples just to get our juices flowing on this. Pedro Noguera's a friend who has a piece in the book about acts of discipline. Anyone ever suspended in school? Okay. How did it affect your relationship to the school when you got suspended?
Nice. Like everybody was like, happy about like the last week of senior year, and I had to stay there for an extra week. I was suspended the last week.
Okay, so it was at the end of your school career. What do you think would happen if it had happened at the beginning of it? What would you have felt?
A little better because I was the only senior in school.
So it would have been better for you, you think? Okay. Pedro talks about what happens when an everyday act of discipline can really corrode a kid's relationship to the teacher who did it or to a school. For example, teacher in one of my classes brought in the example of a young man who was wearing a Celtics outfit and felt really great about himself, came in like dressed to the nines, and the school had a uniform policy that only got applied once in a while, and somebody applied it. So he ended up in kind of lockdown in the basement for breaking the rules as math went by, as English went by, as science went by. And the teacher who brought in the story said that she could see his feelings. He walked in like this, saw his feelings about school just melting away. And he literally was saying, I hate this effing school, by the time he was done with this lockdown situation in the basement. So this one act of discipline, serious consequences for a young person over time. This is why it's so important. A lot of people talk about zero tolerance policies. What does it mean when you suspend a kid for 3 full days for a small infraction? Just happened to the son of a friend of mine at my daughter's school. What does it do to the young person's relationship to school? John Baugh has a piece in the book about how educators react to students' speech. Anybody ever had an educator react negatively to the way you were talking? Nobody? One of you? Okay, how did it make you feel? Okay. So you stop volunteering to read out loud in class. Okay, one act, not necessarily taken, I don't know how you felt about it, but not necessarily taken because a teacher hated your guts, but a comment made to you, real implications for then reading out loud in class. What does it mean for you as you develop into the next class where you're asked to read out loud? Real implications. We've seen in education how many times kids have been referred, there have been lawsuits about this, kids referred to special education for speaking Black English, for example. A lot of kids over-referred to special education for speaking a dialect of English or for being an English language learner. When you actually don't have special education needs, somebody reacts to the way you talk and puts you in special ed, which in this country often means you're in some segregated environment if you're a kid of color or if you are lower income. If you are higher income and have the power and the knowledge to navigate the system, you often end up with an IEP attending to your needs in your regular class. Extra help, great. But that situation can really screw you up if you are put in a situation that is not helping your needs, and sometimes that can be triggered by a teacher's reaction to how you are speaking, what you are wearing, one thing you said, ways you acted. Here's another example of how it can affect parents, for example. Eugene Garcia has a piece in the book about how his younger sister went to school for the first day, and the teacher said, "What's your name?" And his sister said, "Ciprianita," and mom was with her. And the teacher said, "That's a pretty name. I can't pronounce it. Can I call you Ellen? I've always really liked the name Ellen." And literally applied the name Ellen to her, and mom never came back to school. Mom stayed at home saying, "You've got to finish school, you've got to graduate, education's really important," but she never went back to the school. So what does that mean for a relationship between a parent and a school, and what does it mean then for the child? These are the consequences of everyday acts that we need to think about. Carolyn Tyson's piece gets us thinking about the moment of us being assigned to gifted. It's sort of the flip side of being assigned to special ed. And we know from research that those moments of tagging you can have real consequences for how you think about yourself. In terms of being assigned to gifted education, we call that often the anointment effect in research. I'm gifted. It does something to your sense of self to have somebody say you are talented in something. And we know actually from research that has consequences. You are more likely to end up in higher college prep classes in high school, more likely to end up pursuing higher education, et cetera. So of course in this project, we're not saying name fewer kids as intelligent. tag fewer kids as having gifts, but we are saying, what does it mean to tag some as gifted and others as not gifted, as lacking gifts, as in need of certain kinds of remediation? When is it helpful? When is it harmful? So let me give you this model, because it's important to think about also how everyday activity is not the only place it's at in terms of racial inequality, but it's a crucial place. Rebecca Blank is an economist, so she thinks about dollars and how they travel over time. And I find this model, it was sort of this real incredibly sort of clarifying for my brain, so I wanted to share it with you, and I encountered it a couple years ago. What she says is, look, racial and race class inequality, she has a concept of cumulative discrimination, but also cumulative advantage and cumulative disadvantage that grows over time. She says, look, racial and race class inequality, first, it accumulates over generations. Second, it accumulates across domains. And third, it accumulates over the everyday life of a child. So let me give you some examples of each of these. 1830s. Have you heard of Horace Mann? Anyone heard of Horace Mann? Okay. Horace Mann is sort of known as someone who extended public education to a lot of kids in the United States. In the 1830s, he was extending it proactively to white kids in the United States. At the very same time, anti-literacy laws, same time, were saying that if you were a slave or the descendant of a slave, an African American, you were not allowed to learn to read, period. So think about that. One group of kids offered free public education, free schools, that we all now benefit from today. Another group told not to even be able to learn how to read. What are the consequences of that over generations for your family, particularly if a free public education launches you into higher paying work, higher paying job, etc.? By 1900, we often don't think this late about kids not having schools. By 1900, black people were still arguing for the extension of public education in the South to black people. So schools, period, still arguing for them by 1900. By 1910, only 1 in 12 black kids in the South who was at the age to be in high school was in high school, 1 in 12. She wants us thinking about the consequences of that over generations. Here's another one we often don't talk about in classes in the US, and that is the segregation of Mexican American kids. So in the 1930s, 85% of Mexican American kids in the Southwest were themselves segregated into separate schools with inferior resources or separate classrooms, or told to drop out after the early grades, or told to go to vocational education. She wants us thinking about how that has consequences for your family's accumulation of wealth over generations. So let me give you a personal example, which is the example of the GI Bill. And the GI Bill was given preferentially to white people after World War II. And after World War II, my grandfather, Jews were being renamed as white right after World War II. That's a whole other story. We won't go there right now. But he benefited from the GI Bill. What did that mean? This is in Shaker Heights, Ohio. What it meant was that he bought a house. And my father got to go to school in a neighborhood where there were a lot of houses paid for decently and property taxes that could support a very good public school system. It meant that when he moved to Iowa City, Iowa, which is where I grew up because that's where he ended up getting a job, there was enough wealth accumulated, both because of that GI Bill investment and also because Grandma was a good investor of that money. They helped him buy a house in Iowa. And I went to schools served by decent property taxes. And I went to college without even thinking about not going to college. So Grandpa actually didn't go past elementary school, even though he worked every day of his life. He didn't finish past elementary. My dad went to college. I then went to college. By the time I wanted to buy a house in Somerville, Mass, there was enough wealth accumulated still from Grandma and Grandpa. They were able to help me buy my house in Somerville. Now, what does that mean? It meant that because my mortgage had some additional assistance, I was able to use the money from my job that I got also from having a college education. And I could pay for my kids to go to, for example, to preschool instead of sitting and watching TV with my friend down the street. Now, what that means is the accumulation of advantages over time. So a generation after these kind of post-war policies, African Americans whose parents came of age at that time will receive less than 1/10 of the inheritance of their white peers at that time. So what she wants us thinking about is actual dollars over time. And this is a really important way to think about what we mean when we say white privilege. Now, we don't mean to say all white people are rich, all people of color are poor, but she wants us thinking about basic dollars over generations. And it's important to think, a lot of times when we say white privilege, it's often about things like, my Band-Aid fits my skin, and so, it matches my skin tone, and so therefore I'm privileged. She wants us thinking about like real dollars over time. Now, Grandpa worked hard. He worked hard over time, but he was given a benefit along the lines of race that turned into a serious class benefit, and that's what we mean when we say white privilege. That links to inequality accumulating across domains. That's the second thing we need to think about when we think about inequality in education, and that is, because I can pay for my daughter to go to preschool, my job also means that she has health care that's decent, and it means that if she needs glasses as she goes along, she can get them. If you don't have health care, you don't have glasses, you can't see the board in school, your health care affects your schooling, right? Another thing that affects schooling is mobility. So if you are unable to hold down your rent payments, for example, because you're struggling financially, you move schools, and that has real implications for how you do in school. So this is the idea that what happens to you in one domain affects how you do in education, for example, that these things come together. So who's heard of the Harlem Children's Zone? Has anybody heard of that project? Okay, Google Harlem Children's Zone. What they're trying to do is basically connect the domains, put health clinics in schools, have preschools connected to healthcare, so that there are referrals, right? They're trying to connect the domains. But also what they're really trying to do is to get people talking about the everyday treatment of kids. And so that is the last piece of inequality that we need to think about. I just want to add one thing to the second bullet, because it's really important to also not have a deficit analysis and say, if you have accumulated disadvantages, low-income neighborhoods are all about disadvantage. That's not the idea here, because of course, if you are in a low-income neighborhood that's very diverse, there may be plenty of advantages. Building resilience, being multicultural, being able to move across domains, having parents who fire you up to make it. But aggregated and accumulated economic disadvantage puts all those things in one place. And if you are a new immigrant to this country, often you're moving into a situation where a lot of people around you also lack health care, also are mobile, also have issues with stable housing, et cetera. So that's the idea of cumulative advantage and disadvantage. Okay, last one, though, is even over the everyday life of one person, how things add up. So here's a question. Who is involved? Did you guys take the SATs? Did you have to take the SAT? Okay. Who is involved in your SAT score? Was it you and your innate aptitude sitting down to take the SAT? Or was someone else involved in it? Anyone in your SAT score? Who helped produce your SAT score besides you? Anyone? A teacher? Who else? Anybody take a test prep class? Ever? You never did that? A lot of kids that I teach did. Very heavy test prep involved in their SAT score. Who else is involved in somebody's SAT score? Sibling? Did your sibling ever help you with your homework? Did a friend ever help you with anything? Homework? No, you're a solo flyer. How about a parent? Is your parent involved in your SAT score? Okay. When I was in 3rd grade, I took an endless number of those SRA cards. You guys are too young for these. We might, bubble, 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 bubble. Total preparation for bubble tests, right? Okay, a lot of people were involved in your SAT score, not just you and your little brain in a jar. And so it's very important to think about how kids get prepared for things over time. Have you seen the movie Slumdog Millionaire? Anyone saw that? All right, he knows all the answers to those questions, not because he's an innate genius, but because he has encountered people who gave him the answers, right, over time in different scenarios in his life. And that's the way we could think about even things like IQ tests. We often think about the IQ test as the ultimate measure of your innate. No, it's actually the measure of your life experiences and whether they have prepared you to take the IQ test. That's what it's about. So it's about whether the interactions you had with your parents prepped you to have the same interaction with an IQ tester. That's really what it's about. So it's very, very important to think about what happens to us every day and how it affects us as we grow. So even something like dropout, which we often talk about, you know, it's a pattern, it's a statistic, it just happened at the end, it just dropped out. No, dropout is a process. Dropout happens through many, many interactions over time. When I worked at OCR, we had a case where kids were getting referred to the police department for being in the hallway, Latino kids, because there was a sense that they were gang members. So they were in the hallway, they're wandering the hallway, equals gang member, equals police referral. Massive consequences of one little slip of paper for your life. Talk about school to prison pipeline, right? So it's very important to think on all these levels. If you are a teacher, it's not only you that creates a kid's dropout. So this is not a reason to hide under the bed and never go to work again, but you're part of it. You're part of a cycle. So is healthcare, so is housing, and so is generations of experience. So for example, in Somerville, where I am now, let's think about the issue of translation. Whether there are employed translators is in some ways a structural, big issue. Does the district put the resources in the right place to hire the translator so that people who speak Creole can get the form in Creole, right? But there are also all kinds of everyday decisions about which forms get translated, who gets which information in their backpack. And if you miss the translated handout about this free science fair in Cambridge, you don't go. I went. I got the handout because I read English, and I got it, I read it, I went. My son programmed a robot. Now he's all into robots. He wants his little Bionicle books. He wants to make everything. One moment. People talk, there are stories about who becomes mathematicians. I met someone at Columbia who was writing a big project on black mathematicians. Many of them experienced moments outside a window, listening. Someone sees them. Come on in. Come into this calculus class even though you're only 14. All right? Those kinds of moments can make a difference. What it means that positive moments too make a difference, that pathways can change on a dime positively as we're going through school. And so all of this is meant to say everyday things really matter, and that means we can change a child's life as a teacher. And it also means why it's so excruciating. Anybody ever been in a classroom where the teacher was reading the newspaper instead of teaching you? Anyone? Okay, and 1, 2, okay, 3, all right. Teacher might be thinking, is not necessarily an evil person, I don't know, but that has serious consequences to spend those minutes, those hours without teaching, okay? It has consequences for young people. So taking our activity seriously is really what this is about, and saying the everyday things I do really can make a difference. Okay, now I want to ask what you guys want to do, because we can do a couple things. We have together, if we want, we have half an hour, right, Dan? If we want to take it, okay. So we can do a couple things. We can just open it up for half an hour of Q&A about everything that you want to talk about, or we could also take a little more time. What I do when I teach workshops and also when I teach classes of people a little older than you, but not much, but people of all ages, is go through the gallop of history. Meaning, why are we even doing this? Because it's important to build the context to say how we got here. I already did that a little bit with Rebecca Blank, but it's important to understand. First one's really important, and we often forget it. Race categories like black, like white, like Asian, over time, more in the 20th century, like Latino, these are made by people. They're not genetic. And if you think about them genetically, you've got a bogus idea in your head. So we talk that through very explicitly in this Gallup. Another thing, it's really important to think about how law made it in American history that some types of people got opportunities more than other types of people. And the last thing, this one's really important, is that science over these hundreds of years supported ideas, racist ideas, that some types of people in particular were smarter than others, more beautiful than others, more motivated than others, and that science pumped these ideas into the air, and they're still around. So that's why it's important to do anti-racism, because all this stuff is still around. So we could do this Gallup, I can try and do it super quick, or we can just stop and talk. What do you guys want to do? Regardless, we will stop and talk shortly. What do you guys want to do? Where are your brains? Where's your energy level? Speak. Tell me. What do you want to do? Anyone?
Maybe a few questions and answers.
A few Q&A? Okay. Yeah, let's do it. What would you like to say?
That was really good. I can see how over time that inequality, racism, I think it's very obvious how some races definitely got, lower, information is knowledge. Not everybody gets told everything,
Yeah.
I don't believe being blatantly lied to when you don't get told something.
Right.
If somebody doesn't tell you something, that's like being lied to.
Yeah.
And I think that happens. I mean, I've actually seen it happen.
Yeah.
I used to coach baseball, and some kids didn't even get told about practice, or we'll call you.
Yeah.
What are you telling the kid you're gonna call for? The practice is Sunday at 4.
Right.
Tell them. I mean, I'm just trying to.
No,
think
I
of
hear you
examples.
totally. Exactly.
And it's like
Yeah.
the kid had, a little bit of issues, but it's easy without them again.
Exactly.
And I just
Yeah.
thought that was wrong. I didn't feel as though,
Yeah.
I don't like seeing people be discriminated against. That's just me,
Yeah.
I always spent a little more time trying to help that particular kid.
Right.
I'm thinking of one thing, one situation in particular, but I've actually seen it in different circumstances as well.
You're onto something really crucial. It's actually the core of this Oneville project in Somerville that I was mentioning. It's how can people share information equally and equitably across a community so that kids can actually be served well. And there are a million examples in education of that not being done well.
They don't want it done well. I really believe they don't want it done well.
Because then the kids at your practice, right? Easier
I
to
don't believe
exclude.
They want that.
Yeah.
I don't believe they want it.
Yeah.
It sounds all good when you talk about it.
Right.
Okay, you want it,
Yeah.
But I don't believe people really want it.
Really want the inclusion.
Oh, no, they don't. They'll talk about it,
Yeah.
but they're not gonna do it.
Yeah. Let me give one example after you're done.
You were talking about an IEP earlier.
Yeah.
I know, I'm personally a parent of a son who was on an IEP plan all the way through school.
Uh-huh.
And I personally feel that the school department didn't follow through. Like, they would list a bunch of things on it they were gonna do with them.
Yeah.
And then when you go to your second IEP meeting, say there was 10 things listed, you were lucky if they even hit on 2.
Right.
I feel in the Fall River public school system, and I hate to say the Fall River public school system, but I think my son was more just pushed along.
Right. Yeah. So the flip side of we have not getting the information. There are a lot of kids. When I taught high school in a town in California, I don't name because I wrote this book about it, a lot of the kids of color had IEPs. Nobody ever showed me the IEP. Now, that's actually a civil rights violation to not even know that the kid is supposed to get specialized services. So then there's having the IEP and not doing anything about it. Both of them are examples of negligence, and it's hard to say whether people are actively trying to take opportunities from kids or just letting things after things slide because people aren't treated as worthy enough. That, I think, is core to what racism has always been about. So this Gallup, if I had done it, I would also have been telling you things about how central it was in several centuries of American science to first name types of people because of slavery and colonialism, to say who got which opportunities, to write laws saying if you are a non-white person, you can't be a citizen or own any property, equals no dollars. But then to have science say, literally for generations, study after study after study, rank, who's smarter, who's more beautiful, study. And so that idea of who's worth it, along race lines, but also we know along class lines, also along language lines, and in many cases along gender lines, but who's worth it? That's at the core of all this stuff. So if you get the information, if people follow through on it, there are deep questions of whether a kid is treated as worth the attention. Really, really serious. I wanted to give you one example of what you mentioned, which is they did a sting operation. I think it was Acorn, the community organization. They did a sting operation in New York where they literally sent parents who looked different to a school to ask for the gifted information. And white parents were handed immediately, even without asking, handed the gifted information. And parents of color were told that the classes were full and actively not given the information. Now that seems like an extreme example of disparity, but it really is about information. Who gets it? There are less extreme examples, like in Cambridge, and even in Somerville, a lot of the information about like where are the good schools, I don't know if this happens in Fall River or New Bedford or where you grew up, happens on the playground. It happens on the soccer field. People saying, oh, the best schools to go to are blah, blah. Now, if you're not in that conversation, if you're not welcomed into that conversation, if that conversation isn't in the language that you can speak, what you're missing out on is that informal information sharing, right? How do I navigate the IEP process? There are a lot of immigrant parents really struggling with that. A lot of non-immigrant parents, yeah? Like, how do I handle this process, the special ed referral? Then I have to be in a meeting where we talk through this disability. Then we have to be in the meeting where we name the services. And then I'm supposed to keep track. I don't know how to do any of this stuff. And parents who know how to work it, and what I saw at the Office for Civil Rights, they were often white middle-class parents who really knew how to work it. And in fact, the kids who get the most time on the SAT are white middle-class boys. Extra time because of disabilities. Not saying they don't necessarily deserve it. I'm saying that they know how to get it more than other people know how to get it. Their parents know how to get it. And those are the ones who really got everything on that IEP enforced. When I worked at OCR, it was at the level of Johnny, people knew how to use the OCR, the civil rights system. Johnny needs his assignments written on blue paper, green paper, and pink paper every Friday because he has a processing disorder of this kind, and if he doesn't get it, then the teacher's in trouble. That was the level of detail that some kids got.
I got some of that once I tried to add some advocate with me.
Exactly, right. So you knew how a little bit, you knew some of how to work it, right? Other parents don't know how to work it. Kids, particularly kids of color and lower income kids, special ed is, here's your room, and here's your movie, okay? Very, very dangerous. Go ahead.
Like in all through junior high and high school, I know I had AED and I was always thrown into special needs and not really needing it because like I took the medicine that could help it, but
Yeah.
like I would go to junior high and I would tell the principal and they'll be like, special needs, not even asking my mom and dad.
Oh, really? Okay, well, that's not legal, but okay.
Well, you know, they asked me, my parents said I didn't need it, so I eventually got taken out of it. And I
Okay. Right.
It's like a stereotype of having AED, you need special needs on that.
So were you in a separate classroom? Yeah, exactly. So think about what it would have been. What do you think would have been better for you?
Like I can handle it with like medicine, but if I forget to take it, I'll be like, you know, all messed up.
Uh-huh. So medicine,
I
yeah.
concentrate after I take the medicine, so it's like, oh, fine, but I just need to be like constantly told to pay attention, like
Right,
not like branch off and do other things or sit still.
right. Yeah,
But I never got that because it was just like special ed, like here's a movie, watch it, or here's like work and it goes so slow that I'd be done with all the work, but everybody else in the class wasn't, so I would just sit there.
okay. Sitting there while the clock just, okay, so that drives me crazy. And so that's the kind of situation of detailed attention versus here's your room, right? Yeah, very, very dangerous. Other examples of things you have seen or dealt with, maybe along race lines, maybe not, maybe along class lines, maybe along language lines. Go ahead.
I went to Westport High, and I don't know if anybody's familiar with their dropout rate. You'd actually be really surprised because kids are encouraged to drop out. I've talked to several of them. When I entered as a freshman, my class was like 96 kids, and when I left, it was 62.
Mm.
And most of them had dropped out, or I don't know how it is in other schools, but you get suspended for like if you miss 3 days of school, and you know your parents said that you weren't going to school, they'd suspend you for like 10 days. But how is that productive if they're suspending you for 10 days? I know kids who just wouldn't come back after 10 days,
Right.
stuff like that. I've talked to 5 or 6 kids who were in my senior class who were told, like, why don't you just drop out? Who actually said that. I was there when one person was told that, like, I don't understand why you're still here. You obviously don't like school and you consider dropping out.
Really?
And he did that day. He signed out.
He did.
Yeah.
Can you imagine telling a kid that?
Oh yeah, I've
Right.
heard it done. I've
What
talked to several
chances
people.
does he have
It's
after
crazy.
that?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's not even racist. That could be white on white.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not giving him the time or the attention or any of the other kids.
Yeah.
My class shrunk so much by just encouragement like that. There was no encouragement.
Right. Sometimes in people call that push out instead of drop out. But somebody, a lot of times somebody will say, well, I never pushed this. Come on. I never pushed this guy out of school.
Somebody that I knew that he was special needs and he had like the ADD and he said that he wasn't. He could learn fine. But they kept putting him in the classroom all through middle school, all through high school, just that one classroom. developed this new class of kids with emotional problems.
Hmm.
And he didn't have emotional problems. He had ADD, and they put him in this class. And his mom kept saying that she wanted taken out, and they kept telling her that, you know, they thought it was good for him, they thought it was good for him, and it turns out they only got funding if they had a certain number of kids. So they pushed kids into that classroom so they could get funding for this emotional program,
Hmm.
or whatever it was, and he ended up dropping out along with the kid who was in that classroom graduating.
That example is a really great mixture of policy meets everyday. Because you have this big thing, policy saying you get this many dollars if you get this many kids with this label in this room. But then there's all the people putting them in the room and all the little conversations about maybe you should just like think about leaving, or here's your room, right?
A lot at Westport, it was very often it was said, why are you here? It's high school. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you're supposed to teach us. And they would say, why are you here?
Right.
Are you sure you want to be here?
Should be saying that to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
My son was pushed all the way through elementary school, not being able to read. By the time he hit sixth grade, he had a third grade reading level. And when I kept arguing point with all his IEP meetings and everything, they kept saying, oh, he just doesn't want to learn. Or like the teacher would say, David, it's time for you to read. He'd take the book or paper and crumble it up and throw it on the floor because he couldn't read. And all these years, they kept saying that it was just because he didn't want to do it. Finally, sixth grade, they started listening. He went for a 2-day evaluation up in Boston Children's Hospital. My son was severely dyslexic, and they just kept telling him that it was just because he did not want to do it.
Wow. Yep.
So now he's here, actually. He's here getting his GED in BCC. He's 21 now.
Uh-huh.
But I mean, 16, he was in one of those classrooms where you had to sign that he could be restrained and everything. Next thing you know, they're pressing charges on him, saying that he's hitting the teachers. Look, there's 5 grown men holding my son down. What do you do? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and this is a thing that teachers have a really hard time figuring out, because by the time they get David, he's pissed, right? And so they're like, he's mad, it's his thing. He's got attitude issues, he's got emotional problems, he's got blah, blah, blah. But this is why it's so important to think about all the experiences David has had with his dyslexia and why he's so frustrated. Sorry?
They took him through in a frat program, and the frat program in Fall River it's just a class of school where, I mean, almost every kid in the school has been in and out of detention centers, or foster care, or really out, I mean, in and out of the court system. My son never even picked up a charge until he was in that school.
And then he did.
Bad on the teachers, you know?
Oh, okay, yeah.
So it was so frustrating.
Yeah. And I could see this in the, when you work in a civil rights agency, or even if you're a counselor, you get a big stack of paper on a young person, right? And you can see, if you start reading the early ones, Johnny was chewing gum. Johnny was, suspension, 3 days out. All right, 4 days out. Johnny threw over a chair. Okay, 5 days out. Johnny screamed at the teacher. And you can just see this happening over time. All right, so the teacher, you bring this example, and the teacher says, well, this isn't my problem. He was like this before he got to me. What's your response? Fix it? Fix it yourself? How?
Well, if her son had that plan and everything, had they actually gone through with it from the very beginning, then maybe he would have done better all through school.
Okay, naming specific steps, I think, is crucial, rather than just saying help, 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 right?
He was on an IEP from the age of 4 to 16.
Okay, partnership is crucial. Teachers feel like they're in this by themselves a lot of the times, so partnership with other teachers, groups. What we're doing in Oneville are teams around kids that can communicate actually via texting. That's what we're trying. Teams around kids rather than single people sort of trying to help out kids themselves. What else? Other experiences. What about the key issue of, do the teachers really care enough? Are they actually bad people? Or are they fixable as people? Is this a lost cause? What's your take on this? This is a deep debate in education about whether professional development even does anything or is even worth it. I have my own personal opinion on this, but I'm curious what yours is.
Some teachers care more than others.
Okay. What else?
Depends if they're having a good day or a bad day too.
Teachers are humans also. What were you going to say?
I don't think a teacher should be a teacher if they're not willing to do the extra step to actually help the people learn and actually don't really care. I don't think it should be allowed to have a teacher who just refuses to teach or refuses to care about the people who are trying to learn.
Okay, so the actual refusal to care teacher. the one reading the paper, the one who really won't go the distance. Yeah, maybe in fact is a lost cause. I mean, there are people in education who are trying to bring people into the field who seem like they really, really care and really want to be there, and that's really what they're going after. A lot of the folks I work with care tremendously, but are confused themselves. So they're not sure about which move is helpful and harmful. They're not sure. They're overwhelmed by the classroom. They're teaching that classroom that has been made by lots of people it's not working, right? Why did everybody get put in this room? They're teaching it, and they don't know what to do in it. So to undo that classroom takes a lot of people, right? To undo it. So those are often more the types I work with. Other thoughts on this, though, about the teaching force. If everyday activity is so crucial for what happens to young people in this society, what should we do with the teaching force? Yeah.
I think that it needs to be retrained in regard to children with bipolar, ADHD, because I have a son with the same problem that the lady was talking about.
Uh-huh.
He is still currently in the high school in New Bedford, and now he's almost at the end of his year, senior year. Now he's failing big time because the school is failing to provide the right services, and he has an IPE, but it's very reluctant for them to follow that. So I don't know what to do, but I believe they need to be trained. I think if we have a superintendent in New Bedford that she just resigned, and she was trying to restructure the whole New Bedford education. And she got a lot of heat from the teachers because they're afraid to the changes. I believe if in New Bedford they did the same thing like they did in Rhode Island, that the teacher got fired,
Uh-huh.
I think they're going to listen better. And now Rhode Island is working much better than that.
I worked in one of those schools where everybody got fired. And the same new crowd of people, year went by, the school looked pretty much the same. It just sort of replicated itself with new people. So I'm not sure I agree with you that just firing everybody and without a lot of redoing changes anything. But maybe firing plus redoing, I don't know, it's a pretty harsh move.
They rehire the teachers. Now the teachers know what will be the cost if they don't follow the education for these teenagers because the drop rate was so high.
Right.
And the New Bedford High, the New Bedford High has a similar rate
Of dropout.
dropping out,
Yeah.
especially the Latinos. And they're not doing anything about it. They
Right.
just want to get some more money from the state. They're not doing anything about it.
So we have a number of examples on the table of disability services or IEP services not being provided. There are a lot of other examples in education of language services not being sufficiently provided to kids who are English language learners. So I was just working with a student who now is at UCLA doing a doctoral degree, but when she was younger, she was reclassified over and over and over as an English language learner when she wasn't. She actually didn't need additional, she'd already made it through that part of her education. She didn't need it. She kept getting put in these classes over and over and over and over. There's one piece in Everyday Antiracism where Ted Heyman, the author, gives the example of kids being kept in English language learner classes, ESL classes, because they're such good translators for the other kids. So they help the teacher get through her class when they don't need those services anymore. She was also classified as having disabilities when in fact in her case she didn't have disabilities. She was simply at the beginning learning English. So all kinds of various examples of kids not in fact getting what they need. So a solution, one solution is also, here's one thing, that way I can tie it back. Part of anti-racism is in fact at times individualized attention, making sure that kids get the services that they actually need as individuals. Part of anti-racism is also thinking about all the stuff we've been talking about today, that people live in a world that imagines types of people, that treats some as worthier than others, and that gives opportunities to some more than others. So for example, this is really complicated stuff. Anti-racism is both about saying, you know what, race lenses are bogus, genetically speaking, everybody's an individual, people are too complicated for these simple labels, and it's also about saying that we've been living with race categories and racial inequality for hundreds of years, so we can't act as if it's not here anymore. So it's both about being sort of colorblind in a sense, but also race conscious and racism conscious and inequality conscious. Let me give you one example, and then we'll go back and forth. There's a piece in this book by Sam Lucas where he talks about you know how I said teachers are being shown achievement gap chart after chart after chart these days. And he says it's really dangerous to look at a kid and imagine what their achievement probably is based on some chart you saw. Treat everybody understand where they're at individually regarding algebra, or where they're at individually regarding English, et cetera. So sometimes, a lot of times it's math teachers, and I don't know why, we get teachers who say, you know what, I'm never going to think about kids in categories again. I'm just going to treat them as individuals, only. I will refuse to think about race ever again, and that's why I'm going to be anti-racist. Now, that doesn't fully go the distance, even though it is a key part of anti-racism to say, where are you at on algebra? At the same time, living in a world that has racist ideas in it still means that if you are a kid of color sitting in a classroom learning algebra, you have a weight of lower expectations on you, and possibly from your teacher, than a white kid sitting in class learning algebra. There's actually been a lot of research on this. It's called stereotype threat. Have you ever heard of it? This kind of research? It simply means that if you are wasting a lot of your brain time worrying about how people might stereotype you, you might do less well on the test than you really could, because you're threatened by that stereotype. That's the racism in the world weighing on the kid. So do you understand by the both and? If you ignore that as a teacher and fail to counteract it with extra high expectations, I believe in you and I know you can do this algebra and here's how we're doing it and we're going to work you hard. If you don't counteract it that way, you leave those low expectations in the world. So anti-racism is both about emphasizing individuality and remaining conscious that there's still ideas in the world about types of people and who can learn. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other Q&A or comments or questions or concerns? Yeah.
I just wanted to say that, and you know, it doesn't just happen with like the regular people like me and this gentleman. My boyfriend's a math teacher who retired this year. He had 35 years, and his son's on an IEP, and he's got 17 different things on his plan. And he just went for a meeting a couple weeks ago, and he rejected the plan. He has someone from the Board of Educators going with him to his next meeting because the 17 things that are on his plan were there last year, and not one of them has been met. So it doesn't just happen with, like, I mean, ordinary people. It even happens with teachers.
Mm-hmm. Right. And of course, if you have the disability system, you at least have civil rights. You have the ability to call a meeting. You have the ability to say, here are the things my kids must have. A lot of parents struggling in the school system don't have that track to call the meeting, to have the planning, right? So
They really do try to, like, outnumber you out.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I mean, when they tell you you have an IEP meeting for your child, you go to the IEP meeting, and usually it's you by yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Right.
The education.
And then all the
part
professionals.
group.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of people that are here today who are involved in the educational system who pretty much accept the status quo, who would say you're being naive. And they would say, look, you're not taking into consideration what people bring with them or don't bring with them to the schools. For example, one of the things I hear in New Bedford a lot, where I live, is people saying the parents don't care. They're particularly talking about less educated parents. Well, you know the way those parents are, or you know how many they all come from single-parent families. You hear those kind of statements a lot of stereotypes about
Right.
where people come from. So the assumption is that the parents aren't emphasizing education as much. We're now, as teachers, are getting a bunch of students that aren't getting the emphasis in the home, let's say the professional white kid would get. And then you hear other people maybe not saying it as openly, but they're still holding on to the old ideas that intelligence is unequally distributed.
Right.
So when the book came out a few years ago called The Bell Curve, we basically made the case restated the case that people are smarter if they're white than if they're minorities, right?
Yeah.
That book was a bestseller and was taken very seriously as a serious academic piece of work
Yeah.
rather than basically restating ideas that Adolf Hitler could put forward.
Right.
Right, so I'm just wondering, how would you answer, what would you say to someone who's thinking those things about parents or about intelligence?
Yeah. Well, what we do, this is why we do this Gallup, is because if you actually see it in history, you can see people creating the lie that some race groups are smarter than others, and then you can expose it as a lie. So if you actually can see Linnaeus, you heard of Linnaeus, the botanist who classified plants? Maybe you've heard of him. He classified race groups at the same time in the like 1730s or something like that. He said there are these kinds of people, and he said that the white type is essentially, in different words, he said the white type is smart. He literally named it as if it was a fact, all right? Thomas Jefferson, you can see in the notes on the state of Virginia when he wrote them, trying to figure out how do I justify slavery when I'm calling for freedom for everybody else, how do I do that? And he literally says in this book, Notes on the State of Virginia, I think possibly slaves are unfit mentally for anything but slavery, black people, as a type of person. You see people pumping these lies into the air, and then study after study by white scientists trying to sort of explain Jim Crow, explain slavery, just justifying it over and over and over. So if you look at the history like that, you can see the lie being made, and then you can actively try and undo the lie. So actually, a very important anti-racist act is to talk to kids, as well as teachers, about the fact that the idea that there are distinct subgroups to the human race, genetically called races, is bogus. The idea that some are smarter than others, bogus. These are lies that were put into the air. They're not true. On the question of teachers thinking that some types of parents are better or more motivated or more dedicated or more caring than others, that's a big issue with teachers, and we tackle that one directly in the work we do as well. So we actually talk through claims that circulate in every high school, faculty room, all over the place. Asians are more successful because they care more about education. And the flip side is that other populations don't care about education and therefore are less successful. And we talk about where's the evidence for this, and what does the word care mean? We talk about how caring comes in different forms, how some parents know how to navigate the system, how some parents' ways of caring are reacted to better by teachers than other parents. But we actually have to tackle in education these too easy claims that get made all over the place about who cares, who's smarter, who's more motivated, etc. It's also very easy to explain away who's in AP as just the kids who want to be there. And if you've had your head on today at all, you know that the kids who end up in AP are not there just because they want to. That there have been many, many moments that ended up, that put them there, or that led to the choice of enrolling in it or not enrolling in it. So we have to really take apart a lot of these claims that get made in education that are way too easy. We have to tackle them head on. Yeah, last comment, I think.
Just want to say, what this gentleman brought up, I come from a family that's 3 schools.
Yeah.
Actually 4. And what he said about all the teachers say the same thing. Starts at home with the parents. If the parents don't enforce, doing reading to their children at home at a young age,
Mm-hmm.
encouraging them to do, schoolwork at home, and everything's just play, 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 and they expect the teachers to do all the work at school. It's just not going to happen that way.
Mm.
So you get their side, they get defensive when parents come in and say, what are you doing with my kid? How come he can't read?
Right.
And the teachers turn around and say, well, what are you doing with the kid at home?
Right.
When he comes in, he should know how to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that, the punchline, the partnership, everyday partnership between those two people is the point. If these people write off these people as not caring, that partnership is lost. If these people say, if you read to your kid at night, it's really going to help them when they enter my class, that starts a partnership of doing this everyday work together. Yep, there we go. All right, I think we got to go. We got to stop. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming and staying turned on throughout. Thanks.